Good afternoon. Welcome to our weekly Suitcase Stories conversation with our storytellers. My name is Cheryl Hamilton. I am the director of Suitcase Stories and have been with the International Institute for 5 years now. We really appreciate you tuning in and sharing these conversations and amplifying the stories of our local residents who have both foreign-born and new immigrants, foreign-born and U.S.-born. For those of you not familiar with the International Institute of New England, we are a 102-year-old organization who has been welcoming and assisting new Americans with a variety of services. We provide refugee resettlement, which we will talk a lot about today because our guest came to the United States as a refugee, but also we provide education, English instruction, employment, skills training, legal services, which are more important than ever, and then our Suitcase Stories program. Suitcase Stories was launched a few years ago, again, to amplify the voices of newcomers, but also try to build community through dialogue and talking about our shared interests in family and love and fear and courage, all of which I think we will talk with our guest today about. We are joined today by Ana Flaster, who lives in Lexington, but are you in New Hampshire right now? I know you have deep roots.
I am. I'm in New Hampshire. I'm in Moultonborough, New
Awesome.
Hampshire.
Where is that?
Moultonborough is it's in the Lakes region. It's on Winnipesaukee, Lake Winnipesaukee, and it's north of Nashua, where we settled when we came in 1967. So we're about in the center of New Hampshire, and Nashua's southern New Hampshire.
I was going to ask about the connection. So that's a really good introduction. So tell us a little bit about your background, Ana. I know it from your Suitcase story, but we have viewers that are just meeting you.
So I was born in Cuba, and our family emigrated in 1967 as part of what was called the Air Bridge. It was set up by the Johnson administration in the United States to help Cubans who were opposed to the government leave Cuba safely, not via ocean. There had been a couple of boat lifts by then and attempts to, mass movements of people trying to get out of the country because it became illegal to just leave Cuba after the revolution for the first time in the history of the nation, of the republic. So people were struggling with, well, what do we do if we don't like the way the revolution has turned? We want to leave. There's no way to leave. And so people were taking to the sea. The Johnson administration worked out a deal with the Cuban government. And these flights called freedom flights were set up. Different time, right? In the history of the U.S. response to refugees. Right. But it happened because it was during the Cold War, and we were on the right side of that. Right. We were anti-communist. So we were refugees that aligned with American policy. And fortunately for us. So what that involved was my parents had applied in Cuba for permission to leave the country, had lost had given up their jobs in order to be able to leave the country. Then for 3 years waited for the exit papers without work, just living on rations. And finally it came. The permission came one night as we were sitting down to dinner. We were kicked out of the house. 24 hours later, we were in Miami in a refugee center. 48 hours later, 72 hours later, we were in New York and in my aunt's tiny apartment. 2 weeks later, we were in Nashua, New Hampshire. And I was just about to turn 6. It was December. There was snow on the ground, which was wonderful for a kid, but the adults were horrified. Nobody spoke the language. Nobody knew where to get any kind of food that looked like the food we had always had. And the worst thing of all was that everybody from the kids on up knew that, life had changed forever. And for my parents and my grandmother and my aunt and uncle, when we were all together, they knew they'd probably never see their viejos, their old people again. And so that shaped my life, obviously, as it would anyone. We grew up as novelties really in Nashua, New Hampshire. There were very few people of color, people from other countries. And so we weren't ever a threat to anybody, and working class as we had been in Cuba. And people in Nashua, from the factory workers to the kids in schools, by and large, and in the vast majority, opened their arms to us. I went to Smith College. I studied in Spain my junior year, thinking that I was getting back to my roots, and realizing the hard way that I was not European, that was a different kind of Spanish. And then after college, I started working in the software industry in Boston, ended up having my own little business doing marketing and graphic design, and then stayed home with my kids and began writing.
Did you imagine writing was going to be in your future? Was that something that was always interesting to you?
No, I didn't. I thought it was something that rich Americans could do, that a refugee had no business even thinking about, and that I had two younger siblings behind me to help get through college. And I knew that it was a dream career for me to be a journalist, actually. But I had too much debt. I just couldn't see a way of doing that.
No.
I didn't have the courage. Also,
it's putting our voices out there is a courageous act in itself. So that makes sense. Did you start by writing about your experience, or did you start by writing about other people's?
I always wrote about Cuba. That was my inspiration and my passion. And I always felt like I had a story that I wanted Americans to know about. The story of Cuban Americans and what happened to us after we backed a revolution that went haywire. And I also wanted to try to correct some misconceptions that I saw happening toward the Cuban American community, assumptions about the Cuban American community. So that drove a lot of what I wrote about. I also did a lot of writing about local politics, because I was involved in a lot of pro-school campaigns, and so tried to promote those ideas through my writing.
What were some of the misconceptions that people had or were writing about that motivated you to add your voice?
Well, I felt, once I left Nashua and started studying in college, this assumption that Cuban Americans were all wealthy. They'd lost their sugar refineries and their banks and whatever, and had a chip on their shoulder, and had the sour grapes, which I remember thinking, what does that mean, sour grapes? Because I didn't know what that expression even meant. And I wanted to tell the story that quite a few, if not the majority, of those people were working class and professional class people who had backed the revolution. So that was one thing. And then I also wanted to, do you remember the Elian Gonzalez?
Sure, of course.
Crisis, right? So this is the little boy whose mother drowned at sea trying to get him out of Cuba. He was rescued. He was brought to Florida, lived with his father's family, but then his father asked to have him back. It was a big controversy during the end of the Clinton administration. And there were just a lot of negative depictions of the Cuban American community in Miami, just sort of hysterical, a lot of passion. And we are kind of passionate people, and especially when politics come in. But I wanted to try to explain a little bit why that is, how when you lose your country and your culture and everything turns over like that, you're changed forever. You've come by that passion legitimately. You may not agree with it, but this is the background. This is why these people are as passionate as they are. So that was the motivation.
Right. Do you think that's improved over the last years? I mean, as we've heard more voices, or the attention, for example, this is September 15th, launches Hispanic and Latinx Heritage Month. And
yeah, I do. I think some of it is just over time. You have a younger generation of Cuban Americans getting out there, and some telling the story, some amplifying their viejos, the elders' experiences, some saying, while I honor that, I think differently. And some of the older people, the viejos, also softening. And the stories getting out. All of that is, I think, helped to soften the edges of the view of Cuban Americans. And I think too, with the politics the way they are in the United States right now, and Florida being so important in the election, and the more or less conservative Cuban American vote being so discussed, it's sort of still a lightning rod.
So you started, I'm assuming, with essays, but you have now evolved and written a book that's going to be published shortly, correct? Yes. Is this all surreal for you, or how did that sort of evolution happen?
Yeah, well, as I said, I started to write locally for local newspapers, had some things in the Globe, in the Boston Globe, essays often about the Cuban American experience. It all began, though, with my NPR pieces, which I have a bunch of commentaries on NPR for All Things Considered. And those were mostly about the Cuban American experience. And they began with the Elian Gonzalez story.
Oh.
So where I described my own experiences as a 6-year-old Cuban refugee, and vastly different, but trying to give voice to that child refugee, which, as we were talking before the show, that part of my motivation is to give voice to the very young refugee and the very old refugee, whose voices I think are very muted in this very human experience. After the NPR pieces came out, I started doing more newspaper stuff, and always about Cuba. I had always planned to write a book about our family's transformation from a Cuban family to a Cuban American family, because so much happened, and it was a weird place to transform. Nashua, New Hampshire. Nobody in the late 60s, nobody spoke Spanish. I thought Spanish was a language that it was our family's language. Nobody in the world spoke it. And I remember once, I don't know if you've ever been to Silver Lake in New Hampshire, in southern New Hampshire. We were there and we heard other people speaking Spanish. And it turned out it was an Ecuadorian family, big like us and loud and whatever. And I thought, oh my God, these must be cousins. How come we don't know these cousins? So
that's excellent.
Yeah, so I started writing the book years ago, in between other little, my other writing, and partly through you, because I started telling stories in front of live audiences. I got the courage to really start finishing the book. I pitched it to some agents, got some great responses, and my agents in New York right now, Stuart Krzyzewski Literary Agency, are getting ready to pitch the book. So,
are you allowed to share the name, or is it still?
The working name, I think I can share it. The working name is Radio Big Mouth,
which is curious, but we'll read the book to find out. But you've also been published most recently in another book called Alone Together. Can you share what this is?
Yes, this is a great book. Also, I owe you a thanks for my piece being in here, because this book is about, it's Jennifer Hopp's collection of stories having to do with COVID-19. It's called Alone Together, Love, Grief, and Comfort in the Time of COVID-19. And she wanted to include refugee immigrant voices, contacted you, you suggested a few names. She liked what I wrote. and Hope Sings is my piece. It's a story about how canaries and the love of birds, which is very Cuban, by the way, and Spanish, is helping my father survive COVID because he has 40-something canaries that he's breeding.
And he's alone. I mean, your whole family is still based mostly in New Hampshire, correct? In Massachusetts?
Yep, in New Hampshire. Everybody's in the Nashua area. He lives alone, totally lost in translation. He speaks a brand of English that only some people, who've been with him forever understand. But he's very unique. He's a former professional baseball player. So in Cuba, he came and played in the United States for a number of years.
I had no idea.
In the minor leagues. But he played with Mickey Mantle, and he pitched to Ted Williams, and he's got great baseball stories. That's the next book I'm going to write.
That's amazing. I had no idea. How did?
There are a lot of baseball stories in my book.
So actually, let me ask you about this for a second, because two things. One is there are some silver linings of late. One is that the International Institute of New England has been able to return to resettling families to the United States, including places like New Hampshire, because we operate in Greater Boston and Lowell and New Hampshire. Often I think one of the narratives that's shared nationally is that families like yours that perhaps were more isolated end up moving to more metropolitan areas to find their people, if you will. Are you surprised your family is still in New Hampshire? If so, tell us about that. Like, were you feel really integrated over time, or is it just where your home was?
That is such a great question, because where refugees, immigrants land it seems so random. And maybe initially it is, because maybe one of those families is sponsored by a church, like what happened in our case. There was a Baptist church, of all things, Cubans are largely Catholic, that sponsored a family in Nashua. When we got to New York, they heard through the Cuban grapevine that we were there. They came down, saw us. My parents wanted more space. They didn't want to be in the city. And they wanted to get away from too much talk about Cuba and the past. And my mother always said, if we're in the United States, we're here to stay. We're not exiles, we're here. And that's not common. An exile situation. A lot of people thought exile was going to be a temporary thing. I credit her and my aunt with having the vision to understand that it was unlikely that we were going back anytime soon. And so we had to commit. And that's how they approached life. They also liked New Hampshire because they thought, because remember, in the late 60s, this country was in not unlike what it is today, huge tumult. And they said, if this country falls to communism, we've got Canada, the Canadian border is right there. We can always shoot over that border. So I think they learned to have a plan B. And I bet most of them.
So if you were giving advice to this new family arriving last week, what were some of the things you learned about making that transition, either work, or what were some of the things you'd want to look out for?
Well, that's, I don't know. I think what I would say is believe in yourself. You and your family have already done this incredible thing. You've ripped yourself out of your world for whatever the reasons. And there's a braveness in that and a courage in that you'll draw from for the rest of your life. And you'll be able to go back to it. And you'll reach a point where you'll be able to meld the richness of the two worlds together. And to rely on family. I think if we hadn't had my grandmother, I don't know that we would have all turned out, not that we're exactly solid in every way. I mean, but my grandmother was the glue. My grandmother gave up everything, really. She didn't want to come to the United States. She got dragged along because she knew that her daughters and their husbands were going to be working in factories as they had in Cuba, and they were going to need who was going to take care of those 4 kids. And within a year, my mother had my sister, who was born here in the United States within a year and a half. So there was my grandmother stuck inside a house, no Spanish TV, no Spanish newspapers, radio, and snow all year long.
Sure.
Sun went down at 4 in November. I don't know how she did it. It was really, really hard for her. And so if there are any old people in those families,
Mm-hmm.
I would encourage everyone to pay attention to them and to
Yep.
pay attention to children, because they don't always say what they're really experiencing. They won't tell you, and it's worth digging in.
That's a great point. When I've worked in the field for 25 years now, it's crazy. About 10 years ago, there was really an investment at the Office of Refugee Resettlement federally to start funding senior programs specifically, to really reach out to them. Now, unfortunately, with all the cutbacks to federal funding for refugee and immigrant services, but it is incredibly important. So is the voices of children. So I'm glad you're adding them to the narrative. I should note, if anybody is watching and wants to ask a question of Ana, please put it in the Facebook chat and we're happy to pass it on to her. But I was thinking, if your family and your mother particularly was like, we are here to stay, we are going to, commit to learning about this culture and committing ourselves here. Does that mean that stories were not told as often about Cuba, or was sharing stories in your family always part of it?
No, it was just the strangest thing. It was like, and I talk about this in the book, every single day we talked about Juan. I heard people talking about Juanelo. Juanelo is the name of the barrio that we were from. Every single day, because we all lived together. So there were 2 families in one house and the matriarch and the dogs and the birds and whatever. But Juanelo, the name of the barrio, came up so much that when I was little, I thought it was a person, because my mother's name was Consuelo.
Oh.
Juanelo and Consuelo sound the same, and I thought, Juanelo must be a really good friend, because look at how the old people just smile whenever they talk about her. I wonder if she'll come to visit. Like that's the kind of confusion a 5-year-old about to turn 6 is experiencing. They talk, and they still talk. Well, the ones who are left, about Juanelo, and it was a very colorful place, very working class, very much everybody knew everybody's business, and the women of Juanelo, the old women, never stopped writing to the women here, and they sent my family sent packages to them with little beautiful underwear, lacy underwear, pretty bras, because my mother used to always say there's nothing worse than a communist bra. Besides the packets of Carnation instant milk and practical things and the sewing kits, there's always a box on the counter in the kitchen that was la caja, el paquete para Cuba, the package for Cuba. And there were always hot pink and purple lacy sticking out of it.
Oh, these are the kinds of stories I'm sure we're going to read in your book when it comes out. I can't wait.
I hope people will enjoy it.
You also just reviewed another book, correct?
Yes, there was a wonderful book that came out in May by Anthony De Palma, a former foreign correspondent for the New York Times. And this book is amazing. It's called The Cubans, Ordinary Lives in Extraordinary Times. And it is his account. He went in, basically embedded himself in this township just across the harbor from Havana. And he profiles these 5 really brave families that tell their stories of how they've lived through the revolution, the post-revolution, how their views of the revolution have changed, how their struggles have shaped them, what's happened to their families. These people were incredibly brave, because it's not a society that allows criticism. And De Palma says in his author's notes that he warned them, that he made clear he was going to be, that he wanted to publish, their accounts and could use in their names. Apparently they gave him permission. these people, I think, really want the world to know what has happened in Cuba. And I encourage everyone to read this book. It's a phenomenal book. The reporting, I mean, he's just a great writer. But the way he gets into their lives, it's unique. You will never see that story as a tourist in one day when we can go back to Cuba. So
no, exactly.
If people are all interested in Cuba, they should definitely buy this book, The Cubans, Ordinary Lives, Ordinary People in Extraordinary Times, something like that.
I think that title could be applied to all refugees and many immigrants to this country. I was thinking about what you said about resiliency, and when Katrina occurred, particularly in affected New Orleans, one of the first populations that returned were refugees, and they had said, this was the first place they resettled. They wanted to contribute. They wanted to build back, and I just, again, it's just remarkable.
It's there's courage. There's a courage in refugees. I often wonder. I don't think I would have had that courage. I think I would have been stuck. I would have been too afraid. And I think it takes a certain real guts to do what these people do.
Did you actually, you said your family was preparing for years, but did you know? You were very young.
Yeah,
did they talk to you about it?
I had no idea. And we were persecuted because we were worms. We were gusanos against the revolution. And the government called us worms. In their speeches, Castro called us worms. That's what we were. And we were harassed and people got into fights, and it was not easy. I had no idea, but I remember my family trying to make a game out of it and telling me, you can't really be talking to that family or this family. And they would say, what are you? And I would say, una gusanita, I'm a little worm. Like this, and it was funny, but it was funny.
Right. At the time, right? They had to
made a joke out of it. Wow. They made it funny, and so I thought it was just fine that we were worms, which is, it's such a testament to the love of parents and old people to protect their kids in any way that they can, And I'm sure there's so many of these stories. I'm sure in the people that you help, how those parents. How they shield those kids,
Yeah, for sure. And it's not obviously at all the same, but I think about this pandemic, and maybe it's because I finally saw my nephews after many months, socially distanced this weekend, and they are 2 and 5. And I think about how present and how much will they really understand and look back. They're being sheltered in many ways. And my brother, I really related as an extrovert. My brother took the 2-year-old to a park for the first time in a long time. And he looked at his father and said, "Daddy, people." And I was like, I know. But I think, he won't remember, but the 5-year-old, I'm really curious. Well, that's what I'm thinking with you. It's like, it's again, different. What he'll remember is being at home and watching a lot of TV and playing with dad. But how clear are those for you? Do they come back the more you write?
Yes, they do. They do. But there are some people who have they have the ability to remember. I happen to be a person who remembers usually insignificant things that only matter to me. But I have a cousin who says that I must remember what fallopian tube I slid down. I remember everything. So,
oh my God.
But I'm not sure that all of the memories are accurate, but they're true to me. Yeah. And I'm sure for your nephew, it'll be the same. They'll be true to him. They'll matter to him. They'll shape him.
Ana, I hope there's as much humor in your book as you presented today. That's again one of the
without humor, you can't get through this stuff. You can't get through anything.
It's interesting when we've had Suitcase Stories shows, some people, it's been very interesting. People have left and they're like, there were funny stories. And I was like, right, because that's life. This is one of the problems I have with the narratives around the refugee and immigrant experience is it's often very much the vulnerable stories, which need to be heard, or even the victimization of people's stories. And I think courage and resilience and, lessons that we can all gain is, again, why we think it's important to share these.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I could talk to you forever, and I appreciate you telling the story. I appreciate you taking this time, and I'm so excited to read your book. I'm so excited to read Alone Together. I'm the Extraordinary Person book. I'm going to look out. But I just want to thank you for taking this
Thank you,
time, and I'm
Cheryl.
glad you're back.
Keep doing your work.
Absolutely. There's many more stories out there. And if you're somebody that has a story, whether you are foreign born and want to talk about your immigrant experience, or if you're like myself, born in this country, but have been impacted by migration, please contact us. You can reach us at suitcasestories.org. And we also have a program called the Suitcase Stories Circle, where you get special access to videos and resources and conversations like these that you can share with others. And finally, and then, of course, you can reach the International Institute at iine.org. And finally, Ana Flaster is available at www.ana.cubana.com. And plenty of things to look at while you're at home, socially distancing. So thanks for tuning in as always. Next week, we will also have a new guest every Wednesday. We will be inviting Bruce Marcus, who, like myself, was born in this country, but adopted two children from Russia. And he'll talk about what it's been like to raise them in this country and his experience. Bruce is a longtime storyteller in the greater Boston area, and actually is one of the coordinators of one of the longest storytelling series in the greater Boston area. So we'll talk about all the stories and the impact of them with him. Finally, I will say we also are running a campaign right now called All Together. And All Together is made possible by a private foundation locally who is concerned about our clients and wants to make sure our work continues during these important times. It began as a match campaign for $15,000. If we could raise up to 15, we'd get 30. And thanks to people like yourself who have given a contribution, we are now well over that, and they've offered an additional 15,000 before the end of the month. So we can get up to 60,000. So if you've got $10, 15, 200, this is a great time to give. Half the money goes to emergency services for clients, and the other half goes to support our services. So lots to look into after this. So thank you again, Ana, and thank you for all tuning in. Have a great afternoon.